Hi, this is Clemens and I would like to talk to you about how personal development looks like for an ENFP and how it manifests in the cognitive functions. When looking at the cognitive functions of an ENFP, you will notice that the first function of the ENFP is the extraverted intuition, which means that the ENFP naturally tries to explore all the imaginary possibilities that they find in their environment or theoretically in knowledge, and because they are interested in finding new solutions for the future. And as living in the future and looking for new solutions that are in the realm of the imaginary, they tend to gravitate pretty much outside of society. So if you think of society as this bubble, pretty much grounded in traditional values and norms, then ENFPs imagine different solutions, new solutions that are outside of that norm. This norm is heavily dominated by sensory judges or the traditionalists that are the SJ temperament, which make off around 40% of the population, and the ENFP naturally is pretty far outside of that. So even if the proposed solutions or what the ENFP doing is kind of smart, it is really not so compatible often with a set way of doing things. So often you see ENFPs experiencing conflict because of that, or being criticized because of their new way of doing things, especially, like, for example, in a school environment. ENFPs can be quite smart and can really perform well, but sometimes when they don't adhere to these norms, or when they are faced with a teacher, let's say, that imposes these norms and values, then an ENFP can be easily criticized. Also, like in their private life, when confronted with norms, there can be sometimes harsh criticism when an ENFP utters their ideas or brings them forward. What happens then is that the second function of the ENFP kicks in, which is the introverted feeling, and when criticized, the ENFP kind of normally withdraws, as the ENFP is naturally a rather sensitive type. The ENFP withdraws into their own space and tries to work out whether that criticism they just experienced is justified or not. And depending on how grounded an ENFP is in their first two functions. So the first function, as the extroverted intuition, comes very natural. That's the air an ENFP breathes. And the second function is like the auxiliary function that goes along with that, and basically that makes up the ENFP value system with a natural sense of exploration and gives the introverted feeling guides the ENFP, or kind of feeds back from exploring possibilities. So to check if the ENFP, after facing criticism, is still in line with their values and their beliefs, and whether the outside beliefs should be considered and the ENFP should change course because of that criticism, or whether the ENFP is still on track. This is what the introverted feeling does for the ENFP. So the ENFP normally needs time, withdraws from their environment, and checks back if they are still on track. And then two things can happen. Either the ENFP decides, okay, I'm still on track. This would be like a very healthy response. Or the ENFP isn't on track and changes course. However, the worst possible response is that the ENFP cannot actually process that criticism and then goes into a negative downward spiral. So it is very important in terms of personal development that the ENFP sorts out their introverted feeling and their value system and makes that resilient towards outside criticism. So if a criticism comes and the ENFP hears it for the first time, yes, it takes some time to process, but if that same criticism comes again, it shouldn't be processed again. It should just be like, okay, I processed it once, I made up my mind, I change course or I don't change course. So essentially it becomes increasingly important when considering personal development that the ENFP stands their ground and is grounded in their first two functions and in their direction of exploration and their way of doing things and exploring new ways of doing things and doing things in a new way. What is also quite important for the ENFP is that they develop the third function. So naturally, one can say that developing the third function, this is when personal development really kicks in, and that is where the ENFP has their extraverted thinking. as a third function, which means the logical reasoning behind what they're doing. So an ENFP that only has developed their first two functions, meaning the extroverted intuition and the introverted feeling, naturally will be floating through life, because there's nothing that grounds them. They have difficulty of standing their ground, really, because they don't have the extroverted thinking, logical arguments to back up their point of view. So an ENFP that only lives in their first two functions floats through life in the sense that they try new things, they do something new and start something new, but as soon as they are faced with criticism, they have no way of basically pushing through that or negotiating their way out of it. So their only way of coping with that criticism or that obstacle is to actually change course and start something new. So naturally what will happen to an ENFP that is only grounded in their first, or only works with their first two functions, is that they kind of have a super episodical life and jump from challenge to challenge without ever actually pushing through the conflicts that they're facing. So once an ENFP, however, develops their third function, the extroverted thinking, what will happen there is that an ENFP, when faced with criticism or a challenge, they kind of start breaking that down. They will actually question the arguments, right? So let's say it's a criticism. An ENFP will like, okay, so if you assume A, and B, how does that logical line of argument actually work? How does my logical line of argument work against that and oppose that? And once going through all these lines of logical argument, actually who should be right, whose approach is the right approach, right? And when basically developing this logical approach and actually negotiating with others through that logical point of view, ENFPs can become very, very convincing actually, and often disarm criticism and often show that they are actually right, because they naturally get along well with people. Like, people are very receptive to that logical opinion, and can be convinced that actually what the ENFP is doing might be unconventional, but it makes logical sense. And even if they don't accept it, or if they cannot accept it because they are too traditional in their point of view, the ENFP will find other allies that will help them to actually stand their ground. So this is why extroverted thinking is so important. Also, when faced with a challenge, often an ENFP that is only working in their first two functions are naturally very idealistic, and when basically their ideals or their ideal perception of reality don't take effect immediately, or are not manifested immediately or directly, then the ENFP that is only grounded in the first two functions actually has the challenge of, okay, how do I deal with this? And then often they have to go away or have to give up. But an ENFP that has developed the extroverted thinking, they can actually quite closely analyze and observe what is actually going on in reality, and kind of break it down into sequences and cause and effect patterns, and that will help them to actually come up with an analysis that allows them to find solutions or to identify the problem very closely and have a very accurate perception of the actual problem, and then find a way to solve that problem. Also, like, something that really helps ENFPs to develop their extroverted thinking is typology. So an ENFP that goes into personality typology and understands people and their way of thinking, then can understand, like, very logically how a certain person arrives at a certain conclusion or a certain action, and how to communicate with them in order to find a solution there. So it makes the natural strength of the ENFP, that the fact that they are people, by adding that logic to it, why are people behaving in certain ways, that's where really the ENFP excels, and can find new solutions to new problems, just by understanding that other people don't necessarily think like themselves, but have a different way of thinking, and that needs to be addressed. The last function of the ENFP is the introverted sensing, and the introverted sensing is really something that the ENFP should accept that it's there, and but also that they are probably not so good at it. So an ENFP can focus on their attention on detail and make things perfect with a certain perfectionism. However, this is something that is very exhausting to the ENFP. So that introverted sensing is something that the ENFP can go into for a small period of time. So just to sum that up, basically, with the last function, an ENFP shouldn't be too concerned with it. An ENFP should be gentle, that their attention to detail is limited, and that actually that they can only spend so much time on focusing on detail, on really following set paths and set guidelines and set rules, and that their strength lies more in the realm of exploring new ideas and possibilities, and that that's really the spaces they should be looking for, and that's their strength that they should be focusing on.